This is a Jack Kemp Oral History Project interview with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. We're doing this at Gingrich Productions in Arlington, Virginia. Today is December 13th, 2012, and I'm Morton Kondracki. Thanks so much for doing this.
Good to be here.
When you think about Jack Kemp, what immediately comes to mind?
Boundless energy and optimism. He was a remarkable leader.
And in what, talk about his leadership a little. I mean, in what?
Well, I think you have to understand how much Kemp was a quarterback. And so he got up every morning ready to go on the field. And when he went on the field, he wanted to throw a pass. And he was determined to score. And he thought on offense all the time. And he also thought as a quarterback his job was to arouse and encourage the team. So if you were part of his team, he wanted to make sure you're out there being excited and moving the ball forward. It was just a deep part of who he was as a person. It's part of also, I think, how he enjoyed life. He's really the closest I've ever come to Theodore Roosevelt, and somebody who just enjoyed life, lived it to the fullest. You know, whether it was playing tennis or it was skiing or it was reading books or making speeches, or he just had endless energy.
I was going to ask you about, you said in 1984 that he was the most important Republican since Theodore Roosevelt. I saw that quoted somewhere. Do you remember what the context was?
I don't know where we were at the time, but it was, I think, because, you know, Reagan's domestic policy is really Kemp. And Kemp had come the closest to getting us back to being a optimistic, inclusive, pro-growth, pro-opportunity party of anybody, and had done so against enormous resistance. People forget how bitterly the establishment disliked Kemp and disliked what Kemp stood for.
Talk about that a little.
Well, there are a lot of different factors. I mean, first of all, the Republican Party is historically, you have to understand my bias. I was deeply shaped by Theodore Roosevelt's making the president in 1960, and his description of
Theodore White.
I'm sorry, Theodore White, and White's description of the idea-oriented wing of the party leaving with Teddy, and after 1916 being rejected by the regulars, who actually kind of liked having a party they controlled, even if it was mindless. And I think that string is still there. I mean, I think there's a huge underlying bias in favor of not knowing very much, not thinking very much, and not doing very much. And so that wing of the party, which believed you ought to get in our line and you'll be promoted over time, you should know your place, that wing of the party found Kemp to be outrageous in every way. He'd been a football quarterback. He hadn't been a lawyer. He hadn't been an accountant. He hadn't been a manager. He was noisy. He was perennially optimistic when they were, in fact, dour and skeptical. He was inclusive where they were exclusive. He was for ideas where they hated ideas. They thought of ideas as being risky. There's a wonderful line from H.L. Mencken, who said that Warren G. Harding and his administration represented an army of ants tromping across the desert, who, when they found an idea, would stamp on it trying to figure out what it was, and then leave it behind dying as they kept marching across the desert. And I think that you had to have been in the rooms to understand how much Jack put people's teeth on edge. And then he was for an inclusive party. You wanted people to come in that, you know, lots of Republicans knew weren't Republicans. Shouldn't be. You know, there were folks in South Florida who resented the Cubans. So when you said we're going to be inclusive, they said, "You mean they're going to be here?" There were folks who frankly resented African Americans, and they said, they're going to be here. I mean, you know. And then there were people who were derided women and wondered, why do we really have to have women in active roles? And Jack was very big-hearted. I mean, Jack wanted everybody to play.
So do you have any specific memories of, in those rooms, him putting teeth on edge and getting slapped or people grousing?
Well, I mean, Barbara Conable hated the idea that Jack Kemp had the dominant tax bill, because Jack wasn't on Ways and Means. He was Conable's neighbor in New York. He showed no respect for Conable's seniority. Conable knew correctly that he understood the tax code 100 times better than Kemp. And Conowell didn't understand that didn't matter. That Jack was a political being, not a legislative being, and he was reshaping how we thought. He wasn't reshaping, line 2705 of the code.
So, I mean, he was, he called himself a bleeding heart, radical, conservative, all that kind of stuff, and I guess that was in opposition to Herbert Hoover, right?
It was in opposition to Hoover. It was in opposition to much of the existing Republican Party. I mean, in many ways, it's easy to forget how tough the fights were in the mid-'70s between the Ford and the Reagan wings, and how really different they were. And you see this in 1989 when Bush basically wipes out the Reagan wing of the party. And after 8 years of being Reagan's vice president, repays him by eliminating everybody, because it was that deep and that personal. And it's still there today. And so Kemp represented sort of the activist, noisy wing of Reaganism. So however bad Reagan was, Kemp was worse.
When did you first meet him?
I actually don't know the date because I knew we were going to do this. And I think it was 76 or 77. He came down to, I'd run and lost in 74. He came down to the Republican State Convention in Savannah. And I ended up spending an hour with him talking about ideas. And it was enthralling in part because I'd been an active Republican since August of 1958. And the idea that you'd run into an elected Republican who really cared deeply about ideas. I mean, there were a lot of guys who were smart. They just didn't care about ideas. Well, Jack was both smart and he cared about ideas. And so I got the standard Kemp hour-long lecture on supply-side economics, and it really became the base of my 1978 campaign. I mean, we ran a very supply-side campaign in 78, and I think it actually worked. I think it was very helpful. And I give Bill Brock some credit for having the courage to pay for the tax clipper, which went around, their tax cut clipper, which went around the country. Again, with tremendous opposition internally. I mean, Brock got scarred up for having sided with Jack in this particular project.
Mm-hmm. Brock has talked about how Kemp got ragged over in the Chowder and Marching Society a little bit, but he hasn't talked anything about how he got scarred up.
Well, I'm not sure you even noticed, but people like Conowell did not approve of the Republican National Committee paying for this idea. I mean, you have to remember, cutting taxes for economic growth was John F. Kennedy. The regular Republicans in 1961 opposed Kennedy because they believed in balancing the budget more than they believed in economic growth. Interestingly, one of the people who I found very seminal in all this, there are two essays in 1976 by Irving Kristol in the Wall Street Journal. One is called The Stupid Party, and the other is called The Future of the Republican Party. And they're both worth you looking at because they both were, in effect, without necessarily going out saying Kemp by name, they were, in effect, making the Kempite argument. And interestingly, Kristol said to me the other day that when Ford lost, his father turned and said, we may have to look for Jack in 80 because I can't quite imagine Reagan running.
There was. Kristol and Jude Winniski and those people wanted Kemp to run even against Reagan.
Right. I talked to Jack, I think it was on a Wednesday just before he flew out to California to see Reagan. And because by then I was a member and I was clearly his ally. And he basically said, I'm going to go out and talk to him, and if he will adopt a 3-year tax cut, I'll offer to chair his campaign. And if he doesn't adopt a 3-year tax cut, I'm going to run.
So when would that have been?
That would have been sometime in the fall of 79.
And did he report back what had
Yeah,
happened?
he came back the following week and said, going to campaign on a 3-year tax cut.
See, there's a bit of a dispute over what happened. There was a meeting at the end of 1979 at LAX, at the Marriott Hotel near the LAX airport, and some people say that was the quote-unquote boarding party where Kemp and Dave Smick and John Mueller and people like that, and Jude Winniski was there and Laffer was there, that's when Reagan signed on. as a supply sider.
Well, you'd have to. I mean, it's conceivably it was that late, but I doubt it because Jack was planning to. He had to run in New Hampshire, so I think my sense was I don't have any. I didn't go back and look up any dates. My sense was it was in the earlier in the fall, and it could well be that earlier in the fall Reagan said, "Yeah, I'm sort of for it," and then they had the meeting in which they explained what sort of for it meant.
Mm-hmm. So he's going to fly out there, and he says that if
Basically,
Reagan
he said, "Look, if Reagan's willing to campaign on a 3-year tax cut, I'm going to chair his campaign and help him get elected. And if he won't do that, I'm going to run for president, because we need somebody to represent a growth-oriented, opportunity-oriented Republican Party."
it wasn't clear at that point that Reagan was the supply sider.
No, not at all. In fact, you could have made a pretty good case that he was not a supply sider yet at that point.
And so when Jack got back, do you remember the conversation?
No, just he was beaming and happy and said, Reagan's in and I'm in. Therefore, I was in too.
Right. Do you remember an incident, or did you hear about an incident where Arthur Laffer was trying to get Jack to say that he was going to run, tell Reagan that I'm going to run against you, but I'm going to deliver my delegates to you at the end of the game? And the whole idea, Laffer's whole idea, was to get Jack into the race, basically telling Reagan that he was going to, cooperate in hopes that he would be vice president. Did you ever hear about that plot? No. Okay. Let me go back to '78. So, actually, if I'm not mistaken, the entire Republican conference signed on to Kemp Roth, even though some people probably hated it, in that campaign, and yet the Republicans, you were one of only net 6 pickup in the House. Why didn't that idea, which was sort of, the proposition in California had passed, Jeff Bell had defeated Clifford Case. I mean, it was sort of, even the Democrats were starting to talk about tax cuts. So why wasn't the party more successful?
I think '78 was not yet. There was not a wave. Remember that in '74 in November, we were down to 18% identifying as Republicans. I mean, people have never looked. I'm actually writing a paper right now on this. You go through this trough where you go from the Reagan re-election, which is one of the largest margins in history, to the collapse of the party 2 years later, to the Nixon re-election, to the collapse of the party 2 years later, to the Reagan election and a landslide 6 years later. I mean, this is an amazing trough. And so we were still coming out of the trough. And technically the campaign committee would have told you they misjudged who was vulnerable. They spent enormous resources going after freshmen. And in fact, that particular class of Democratic freshmen were very hard to beat.
So
it was actually, by the way, a pretty big class because we also had a lot of retirees. So we were, if I remember correctly, we were like 59 out of maybe 160 members. I mean, we're an enormous class proportionate to the whole House party, which has a big impact on Cheney and on me and on several other people.
I didn't realize that it was that big a group. So you met with all the supply side gurus, did you?
Not particularly.
Yeah, no?
I mean, I knew them. You'd meet them, but it's not like I went to meetings where we sat down and talked about this stuff.
Well, the one guy who's dead is Jude Winniski.
Yeah.
So give me a word picture of Jude Winniski and his relationship with Jack Kemp.
Oh, I think he was in many ways the person who Jack most respected and who had the most influence on Jack. Because he was dynamic, he was engaging, he had the power of the Wall Street Journal for a long time. He was willing to be aggressive, and much more aggressive and less academic than Laffer. And so I think Winniski played a very major role.
So how often do you think they talked?
I wouldn't be surprised if they talked almost daily by phone. Just because they were symbiotically a partnership trying to create a new wing of the Republican Party, and through that, a new model for American politics.
So what do you think Kemp's influence? Well, we talked about it a little on Ronald Reagan. was. You said that it was the basis of his domestic policy. Did it go beyond supply side?
I mean, Kemp's impact?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, Kemp is a broader figure than just because he's an all-around House member. So he had some impact, I think, in getting them. I mean, he was very much a Cold Warrior. He was very much for defeating the Soviet Empire. So he's a part of the military buildup. He's a part of being supportive of the Pentagon. And once he becomes conference chair, I think he has a pretty broad impact on how things are moving in a cheerleader kind of sense. But Jack had very specific ideas, which I don't know that Reagan either particularly picked him up. But, for example, the experiments in allowing people to have sweat equity in public housing and enterprise zones, I mean, things that we had strongly agreed on that were a big deal. And then Jack, of course, is one of the keys in '84 to adopting a no-tax increase platform, which was a real internal fight.
We'll get to that. So what would you say his influence on you was? And yours on him, for that matter?
I don't know how much I influenced Jack. I think Jack influenced me. He strengthened the idea you could be idea-oriented. He strengthened the idea you could be inclusive. He got me much more intrigued with inner city problems and how are we going to fix these and how are we going to take responsibility for them. And he convinced me that you had to be permanently on offense on ideas in a way that was much more aggressive than I probably would have been if I had never met Kemp.
No one's ever accused you of not being aggressive about ideas. So
no, but he had a cheerfulness about. I mean, every day. I've been aggressive about developing big ideas, but he was every day on offense.
And what did that consist of?
Grabbing you in the hall, talking to you at lunch, giving speeches in the conference, writing papers, being in op-eds, I mean, Jack was pretty much everywhere for a House Republican. Remember, this is an era where the House Republicans have gotten habituated into not meaning much. And Jack was one of the keys towards our coming back to being an institution that mattered.
Did you go to the '80 convention?
No.
Okay, so you weren't there for the demonstration or the speeches. So in 1981, he wasn't on Ways and Means, and Barbara Conable was, and the tax bill that got passed was Conable-Hance. So what role did Jack play in?
I think at that
getting
point
the bill
he's
passed?
rallying the troops and he's creating a sense of support for the ideas, and he's out selling them in Democratic districts. Remember, we have to get about a third of the Democrats to pass the bill. And Jack was always, I mean, in the end he didn't win certain arguments. He never won the scoring argument, for example. He never got people convinced that economic growth mattered in a dynamic way. But he was making those arguments, and he was softening the edge of the people who wanted to have a straight out, how do I cut spending to pay for this? And Reagan basically bought that part of Kemp's argument. So Kemp was like a guy who had suddenly trained an elephant to batter down the walls. I mean, so people like Conable were going to be for the Reagan bill. There's the price of being the ranking member.
So Kemp believed that revenues would go up if you cut tax rates. And
Right.
that, in other words, that tax cuts paid for themselves. Is that true?
It's probably 60 to 70% true. Yeah, I think a larger economy generates more revenue over time. And certainly you look at the Kennedy experience, where they literally expected a loss and got a gain. You can look at what we did with capital gains in the late 90s, where it went up radically. I mean, the CBO score was totally false, or joint tax, if you prefer. So you can make that argument. But it also depends where the rates are. I mean, one of the reasons we're in a different era is Kemp is debating at the end of the 72% marginal rate. Well, you got a much bigger free flow if you're talking about dramatically reducing 72% than if you're talking about dramatically reducing 33%. And I think that's also situational. Remember, the Laffer curve did have a point where you actually got more money. And so you're not always, it's not, the Laffer curve wasn't a straight cut taxes always. It was, gee, you actually gain money by raising taxes till you get to this point.
There are no numbers on the Laffer curve. Did Jack have an idea of what the appropriate number was?
I don't know of anybody who ever thought about what I just said to you.
Mm-hmm.
The Laffer curve was an explanation of why we all agreed in that era that it was too high, so let's cut it.
Right. So,
and by the way, it'd be interesting to ask Art, what does he think notionally the optimum tax rate is?
because Jack at some point said it was 25. Sometimes he said it was 20. I mean, he wanted flat tax in 95. I think he said he wanted a flat tax of 20, and he said he'd just as soon have it 19. Your gang, the Kemp gang, included David Stockman.
Mm-hmm.
Kemp gets David Stockman named OMB director, and then Stockman absconds or turns
Yeah.
coat.
Well,
Coat.
you'd have to ask either David or his chief of staff, who's the number 2 guy at AEI. I don't know that Stockman ever believed in supply side economics. Stockman believed in noise. He believed in being on offense. He believed in lower taxes generally. But I also think Stockman collided with, and I've always thought his book was sort of funny in the sense that it's a cry of anguish from somebody who discovers the world's harder than they thought it was. Stockman then reverted to a standard Michigan Republican position, which actually wasn't far from where John Anderson would have been, who Stockman had worked for. The reason Reagan is such a radical break is Reagan is saying, if your choice is, this is pure Friedman, if your choice is smaller government with a bigger deficit or a bigger government with a smaller deficit, go for smaller government and don't worry about the deficit. And Reagan also is in the position of this being the height of the Cold War of saying, if my choice is deficit or defense, I'll always pick defense. Well, those were, for traditional Republicans, those were very jarring ideas.
How did Jack respond to Stockman's turn, and especially the Grider?
I don't really remember.
Okay.
Wasn't something I remember ever talking to him about.
Right. Okay, so then 82 comes along, and Reagan raises taxes.
Right.
And you were against it, and
Right.
Kemp was against it.
Right.
And Kemp was a leader, though. Kemp
Right.
was the number 3 leader of the House. So, and then he did it in 83, and he did it in 84, and so on. So how much guff did he take for that?
I suspect none from Reagan and some from the White House staff. I mean, Reagan didn't believe in that stuff. When you read Reagan's diary, he thinks it's nuts. They've talked him into doing something he doesn't believe in. It's sort of like the fight over taxes in 84. The White House staff hated what we were doing on no tax increase. Reagan didn't. The reason they could never get Reagan engaged on the platform because he was with us. I mean, he wasn't with them. So this is why. And by the way, there's 2 side anecdotes. One, when they put Reagan on TV and the RNC pays for him to speak to the country about the tax increase, which I think is 82, it's the least effective speech in his presidency, because his whole base tuned in and went, "That's weird. He can't have meant that." Nobody called. I mean, it was just one of those. Well, that was really strange. I wonder.
So why did he do it?
Because he got talked into it. Reagan had been governor. There's one of the great lines is when he says, "The sound you're hearing is concrete breaking." Reagan had been there. Reagan understood these things. Reagan was never, I believe Reagan was never an absolutist. He was a man of general directions. He wanted to defeat the Soviet Empire. That didn't mean he couldn't talk to Gorbachev once Thatcher thought Gorbachev was reasonable. He wanted the lowest rate he could get. That didn't mean he was wedded to not being practical. And he had in Baker, I think, somebody who he trusted, and in Darman, somebody who was extraordinarily smart. My one anecdote is when Bush breaks his word and raises taxes in 90, I'm now in leadership. And so I oppose it. I get one call from Dick Cheney who says, I've been asked to give you a call, see where you're at in this. And I said, Dick, I was just reading your 1982 speech opposing the Reagan tax increase, and I must tell you, it is a marvelous speech. He said, talk to you later.
That was the only call. You didn't.
Well,
get
a couple of the guys called me, but that was the only one that had any hope of getting anywhere, and he instantly got the joke.
Right. So Kemp, though, you think Kemp was an absolutist about cutting taxes?
Yes. Well, and he also understood something that these guys didn't want to confront, which is the Democrats will spend everything we give them. And I suspect Kemp at one level believed in the Grace Commission model. He believed that there is enough waste, that there are lots of things you could do instead of raising taxes. He also remember, 82 is still a very severe recession. So to go back to Buffalo, raising taxes, you have to ask, so what hope are you taking with you? If the tax cuts, remember, have only barely started working when they begin to try to raise them. And the story, which may be apocryphal, is that Darman and Stockman, the night the bill passed the House, actually sat in the car and talked about how to unwind it.
The 81 bill.
Yeah. So here you have a situation where the full weight of the Reagan tax cuts doesn't come in until 83, 84, and they're already trying to screw it up. And you're Jack Kemp, and you really believe in economic growth, and you really want to go home to Buffalo. I used to tell people that two things you have to remember about Kemp that make him very different from most Republicans is, although he represented the Buffalo suburbs, he thought himself as representing Buffalo. He thought of himself as much more a blue-collar congressman than he was. But psychologically, he felt that way. And that he had showered with many people of backgrounds who are not normally in the Republican Party. And that until you understood that about him, you didn't realize how really different he was from the normal Republican.
Do you think that it was the economic downturns in Buffalo that originally got him into tax policy?
Yeah, I think it was really trying to sort out, if we don't believe in socialism, then what do we do to turn this economy around? Again, it's easy to forget, but you start in 73 with the oil shock, a really long decade of pain. Something we're now experimenting with again. And as that wears on for a while, people begin looking around saying, well, this ain't working, so what could we do?
And supply side economics did get the country out of it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
You can argue what the side effects were, but it strikes me that the combination of the military buildup to defeat the Soviets and supply side economics rebuilt the American economy in the 80s, probably beyond the wildest dreams of any of the people who were doing it.
Some people argue that there was a Keynesian effect. In other words, that Reagan, between the Reagan and the Democratic Congress and defense buildup and cutting taxes, that it was basically stimulus. That
right.
It was.
The question you have to test is, and this is the big. First of all, supply side economics is just general economics pre-Keynes. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just a good title. It's a good sales pitch. What you have to ask is, are you creating incentives that increase the investment in productivity and thereby mop up inflation? Because the downside of Keynesian economics is that you create inflation because what you're doing is you're maximizing demand, which is chasing too few goods. And Kemp understood this. The other factor, which I think made an even bigger case in the long run for the supply side, was as you grew into a bigger and bigger world market, you had better find incentives for investing in the U.S. because you need to continually upgrade your equipment if you're going to compete with lower price producers. And Kemp sort of intuitively understood that. He didn't understand in any great way, but and he wanted to be in a world market. He didn't want to be a protectionist. So that meant he had to have a strategy that optimized the continual modernization of productivity in order to keep open the border and keep Buffalo employed.
Right. The one thing that he was also pretty absolutist about that he never got anywhere with, and I wonder why, is a dollar as good as gold, or a gold standard. He talked about it all the time, and nobody seemed to listen. Why was that?
Well,
not even Reagan.
Listen, I had the same problem this year in space. There are ideas whose time has not come, may not come, or left. Okay, and there's actually a line which I can't quote from Tocqueville where he talks about when the larger populace has engaged in an idea, that even the people who are opposed to it quit fighting it because it gets to be too big. Jack had a relatively simple, and this is an important thing to remember about Kemp, he had a relatively simple case. You will have more money in your wallet, and therefore you'll have a better job, so you'll have a bigger paycheck with even more money in your wallet. Would you like that? Okay, now you can get pretty high 90% understanding of that phrase. Now he's into an explanation of monetary policy, inflation, why gold makes sense. And I remember him doing it in Iowa in '88, and it just didn't make, despite the best effort of my good friends who are gold bugs, you couldn't get it down to a point where it made sense to a normal person.
It strikes me. I just wanted to explore whether you think he was courageous in the times when he opposed Reagan, because after all, he was a leader, and and you've been through this experience, and he opposed him not only on all those tax increases, but also he thought Volcker shouldn't be reappointed as Fed chairman.
Well, I think there's just a couple of observations. House members, Senate members, do not serve under presidents. They serve with presidents. They render co-equal judgment. It's really easy to forget that. We're not a parliamentary model. Okay. Kemp had been in a party where people were pretty cheerful on the right, disagreeing with Gerald Ford. He was in a party where people on the left, Packwood, for example, were pretty cheerful about arguing with Ronald Reagan. And I think he's sort of saying, I have the same rights as these other guys do. In addition, Jack thought a lot of his own judgment. And he would have thought he was failing to do his constitutional duty to not render that judgment when he significantly disagreed with the president. And I suspect he felt he was on the president's team enough that the president knew that overall Jack was his friend, even if on this one item, and sometimes the one items could be 5 or 6. But it wasn't in opposition to Reagan. It was focused on a series of specific things that I think he felt coming. So I doubt if he ever very much worried about it. Plus, people who would be, I don't quite know how to say this right. I think there are people who come into Congress to actually pursue something they believe in. And I think they measure their career and their lives by the pursuit of what they believe in. They don't measure it by the esteem of people around them for whom, frankly, they don't care. I suspect most of the people who would be the most hostile to Kemp, Jack didn't care about. He would have said, why would I pay attention to those are the guys who would keep us a minority forever? And I think that was a piece of this.
Did he care as much as you cared about winning control of the House?
Well, I think he cared about winning control of the country. But Jack was I think was probably always a presidential figure rather than a congressional figure. He was always trying to figure out the larger story, the larger campaign. I don't think Jack, although he campaigned a lot, I don't think Jack spent much time trying to figure out how to get a Republican majority, or thought of that as his assignment. Remember also that as you can remember from your own experience, prior to late Tuesday night, 1994, there was no one who thought we'd get a majority. So why would Kemp have invested himself in the impossible? He could imagine reshaping national policy. He couldn't imagine electing a Republican House.
Tell me what you remember about the 1986 tax reform.
Well, let me tell you one story about Kemp from a different angle. Early on, until it was killed by the Reagan people, the Tidewater was a conference of ideas, which had grown out of something Packwood had actually done in Oregon. And I will never forget, so this must have been because the Reagan people killed it pretty quickly once they were in charge. This is probably the spring of 1980. And we always went to Bob Bauman's house when he was the congressman from Eastern Shore. So you do the Tidewater Conference in Easton, and then a bunch of us would go to Bauman's for lunch before we came back. And I remember one day, which must have been in the spring of '80, walking around this buffet table, filling up our plates, with Kemp lecturing me on Napoleonic tax policy in the Rhineland. And I'm thinking, I'm a PhD in history, and I know a fair amount about this, and he's technically right in his argument. And it was just a very interesting example of how much he knew, how passionate he was. But it was also very Kemp-like to be in the middle of this passionate argument, walking around the buffet table, talking about this stuff. The other side of it, I once asked Steve Hanser, who's been my mentor since 1973.
I'm sorry, Steve.
It's Hanser, Hanser, about a Jack, and he said, you have to understand that Jack's an autodidact. And the great challenge with autodidacts is what they really know, they know really well. But they don't know what they don't know. And so they actually assert their ignorance with the same intensity as their knowledge. And I think some of the things you'd see where Jack would go off cliffs would be that kind of behavior.
Where would he go off the cliff?
Well, the gold standard's a good example. I mean, the gold standard would have been a crusade comparable to supply-side economics. It wasn't something you could do in passing. It wasn't something you could do occasionally. I mean, to have actually tried to drive that into the national consciousness would have been an enormous undertaking.
What's the difference between an autodidact and an intellectual, or is there one?
Well, I think the large difference is between an autodidact and a professionally trained person. The number one characteristic of a professionally trained person is you understand how much it takes to learn, and you know how little you've learned. So you have enormous respect for the ignorance that's around you, which is yours. If you're an autodidact, you know how easy it is to learn, because you learned a lot, and you know a lot.
He did spend a lot of time learning.
He was an enormously intelligent person, and he loved learning, and he had passion for it. In that sense, probably the person he most resembled was Clinton. They both have this ability to absorb information. That's pretty remarkable.
And he legendarily he reads all the time. Do you think he remembered what he read?
Yeah, I think he had
He had
a very good memory. He read very deeply about things he cared about. He knew a great deal about things he cared about. And I think you'd have to say that he had a rapacious desire for knowledge.
Let me go back to the timeline here. So, what do you remember about the '86 tax reform? Because it started with Kemp Kasten and Bradley Gephardt and.
Well, I mean, as I remember, I ended up voting against it, and I think it was largely because of the way they got sucked into a fundamental mistake of trying to do a revenue-neutral tax cut, which meant that they had to create ironically, they had to create the recession in real estate, which I think substantially weakened the Bush administration. And so I was very dubious. It actually made running in '88 harder, because you suddenly had this whole wave of people who had made 20-year investments and suddenly been told all the ground rules were changed, which I thought was really bad tax policy. But I don't remember where Jack was on this thing, but I remember that
he saved it.
Huh?
He saved it. At the end of '85, Rostenkowski produced a bill which did not cut the personal exemption in half the way all the Republicans wanted it, and there was a huge rebellion against. It was Reagan. Reagan wanted the tax reform, and the House Republicans all voted down the rule, and then Kemp brought Reagan up to the Hill. Do you remember this?
Yes.
And Reagan promises that he'll veto the bill if it comes out of the Senate in a bad way, and so Kemp sort of saved the day. But did you still voted against it even after Reagan?
I think so. But as I remember, Reagan actually comes directly from seeing the survivors of the 101st Airborne airplane crash, which had crashed coming back from the Middle East and killing a pretty substantial number of people. And Reagan had been at Fort Campbell. And so it was a very emotional afternoon. If this is the date that I know I can't remember if it was on Final Passage or on getting it through the House the first time, but there was a moment that was where you just had this sense of the burden Reagan was carrying and the desire to help him if you could at all.
Was the real estate downturn that resulted from the tax reform just a mistake, an oversight, or was it
No, they knew
inherent in the bill?
they knew it would happen. It was inherent in the bill.
Okay. So, what you organized the Conservative Opportunity Society beginning in '83? Is that right?
That's right.
And what was Jack's relationship to COS?
I think it's fair to say that Jack and Trent, and to a slightly lesser extent Cheney, all three were kind of sponsors. They were too big to be involved, and they were too much part of the establishment to be involved, but they encouraged it, they supported it, they were positive about the people who were engaged in it. They protected us from the establishment.
I mean, your group was his group, right?
Right.
Vin and Tommy Mack and that.
Yeah, Duncan Hunter, Bob Walker. Yeah, we would have been the people who would have bonded emotionally with Jack.
Jack supposedly felt uncomfortable, though, being as confrontative as you were.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So did he talk to you about that?
On occasion, but never in a sense of asking me not to do something. But, I mean, Jack came out of a background where we're all going to have arguments, but we're really all friends. It really mattered a lot to Jack. We're really all friends.
Even with your opponents?
Even with your opponents. And so it's really important that we can find a way to do this that's positive.
So I've asked other people this. Here you got a guy who grew up in the most violent contact sport in the country, except maybe for boxing, and and he's very highly competitive, and yet he doesn't hit.
Did you get Bennett to talk about this?
Actually, Bennett. Bennett said that he was constitutionally incapable of it.
No. Bennett one time had the best line I'd ever heard about this. We're somewhere talking in the late 80s, early 90s, and Bennett says to this audience, he says, I was a tackle. Kemp was a quarterback. You're a tackle, you're on the line, you get muddy, you get bloody, you get beat up, you beat up the other guy. It's a really long afternoon. You're the quarterback. You go in a huddle with your friends. You get to call things. You dance around the backfield. You throw a touchdown pass. Game's over. This one guy is really dirty and bloody. This other guy is really clean, and he scored all the points. Which guy do you think the cheerleader runs up to? And I think he caught a very large part of Kemp. I mean, Kemp was a great competitor. He was not a great opponent. It's a really big difference. Kemp played football to some extent a little bit closer to playing tennis.
So you had a completely different attitude. I mean, you were there for combat with Wright and.
My dad spent 27 years as an infantryman. I agreed with Mao. Politics is war without blood. War is politics with blood.
Yep. And Kemp.
And I'd seen
did you ever
my
discuss
party
that
fail.
with Kemp? Did you ever?
No, it wasn't worth the effort.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jack was tremendous at being Jack Kemp, but he wasn't going to change. I mean, his lack of, you'd be asking him to do something, paraphrasing Bennett in a sense, but you'd be asking him to do something so outside his experience and his realm of behavior. And it was as long as he didn't get in my way, I didn't care. I didn't need for Jack to, there's a great story that my mind just went blank. The former quarterback for Georgia and for Minnesota. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, he tells this wonderful story about the coach Bud Grant calls this play, and he pitches out the ball, and then his job is to take out the tackle, who's huge. And so he throws himself on the ground. And to his amazement, the tackle falls over him. And the guy breaks through, runs 45 yards. And he spends all day Monday thinking, this is going to be great. We're going to get to the game film. The coach is going to say, Fran Tarkenton, the coach is going to say, Fran, look at this. We get to the game film. We get to that point. He praises the center. He praises the wide receiver. He praises this other guy. He skips my name. We're walking out. And I walk up to him and I say, Coach, you didn't mention me. And Grant says, Fran, I know you're such a big guy. You wouldn't want to be singled out for something like that. He said, you don't single me out in the future, I ain't throwing the block anymore. Well, Tarkenton and Kemp could have compared notes. I mean, they're both wonderful competitors. They both had huge levels of skill. But, I'd grown up in high school playing tackle and fullback. I mean, it's a very different business. Kemp's the guy who handed you the ball as you ran into the line.
He did have an ego, and he was kind of vain, wasn't he? I mean, he liked credit.
It's a quarterback. I mean, it goes with the trade. You show me a quarterback who isn't proud of what he does and doesn't have a big ego and doesn't want, again, look at me, to quote Laurence Olivier. This is a guy who wants to stand in the middle and has the guts to say, I'm going to stand in the middle of the field with 1:05 to go. And I'm going to get enough passes completed to win the game. And everybody here is going to get to watch me do it. And if I fail, they're all going to know I failed. Well, you better have a pretty strong ego to do that. And I think that was good for him in the 70s and early 80s because it gave him the strength to be deviant from his party in a way that gradually brought the party around. I mean, a weaker, more timid personality could never have done what Kemp did.
So do you have any other favorite Kemp anecdotes or experiences, personal experiences with him, or moments that you remember particularly?
I'm trying to think about what we're talking.
Think along as we're going. So you had an agenda that was called the New Opportunity Society. Was that Kempian?
Yeah, I think most of it was. I mean, I was more of a futurist than Kemp, and I was more interested.
In what way? What do you mean by that?
Thinking about the future, bringing in people like Alvin Toffler. Literally, I mean, if he went towards Winnicki, I went towards Toffler, in that sense. And I was more interested in fundamentally innovating government. Kemp was interested in shaping the incentives of the private sector, and in some ways transforming government very profoundly. I mean, people underestimate how big a deal his effort to create occupancy ownership for public housing and his effort to create enterprise zones. I mean, had we followed through on those two, we'd be a substantially different country today. And my prediction is in the next few years, you'll see both of those ideas come back up. And this is something that the Kemp Foundation ought to do. Somebody should scrub all of his policy ideas and put together 20 Jack Kemp policies for the 21st century. Because you'll find in different speeches an astonishing level of creativity and thoughtfulness and commitment and a belief that people can have a better life and that you can encourage people to have a better life.
By creating incentives to do so.
Yeah, incentivizing the behaviors.
So, lots of people think that the polarization of American politics started in your era, but Jack wasn't a polarizer. Did you, as time went on,
I recommend they go see Lincoln.
Yes. That was a Civil War. Did you and Jack ever talk about the polarization of American politics?
No, not that I remember. I mean, I think we were allies and friends, but I think that Jane Kirkpatrick once had a great line where she said, "Unity does not require unanimity." And so I think there were times when we each agreed, he'd go over here and do this, I'd go over here and do this, but we were broadly allied on a whole range of fronts. And we were particularly allied against liberals and against old line Republicans. So it's kind of a dual alliance.
Wouldn't you say that you were you were lined up against liberals, and he was lined up against liberalism. The sort of
that may be
the idea.
a better way to say it, because he was perennially trying to engage people like Bill Gray when he was the Democratic whip and an African American from Philadelphia. And part of what would happen, of course, is Gray would almost be helpful. And then the public housing union would call him and say, do you really want a primary opponent? Do you want to spend 6 months of your life getting reelected? And Gray would say, Jack, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. What about Wright and O'Neill? What was his relationship to them?
I think my sense would be that he got along with O'Neill fine. And he probably got along with Wright adequately. Wright was a much harder and more partisan person. I don't remember Jack ever coming to me, and of course he's in the process of leaving as I'm beginning to take on Wright. So I don't know that he would have been part of that. And he was also starting in 86, 87, he's moving towards running for president, and he's moving away from worrying about the House. And so he wouldn't have been engaged. Wright moved the House towards a much more partisan environment. And I think that Quello did it initially by stealing the seat in Indiana in 85. And then Wright's whole method of running the place was pretty aggressively partisan. But by that stage, Jack had sort of checked out of the House and was a national figure doing national things. And my relationship with him at that point was to help him his presidential campaign and stuff like that.
Well, let's talk about that. So what was your role in the 88 campaign?
I think I was a surrogate. I went to Iowa a couple of times. In fact, my first trips to Iowa, I think, were for Jack Kemp. But it wasn't something where, he was over there doing that. I went to New Hampshire for him. And I gave him money personally, but it wasn't beyond that. I wasn't central to his campaign.
Did Kemp think he had a prayer, beating Bush and Dole?
Yeah, I think I think Jack is a little bit like me in that we both believed, as I disproved again this year, we both believed that ideas and earned media could carry you beyond the immediate weight of organization.
Some people say that he had a tendency to play off people against one another in order to maintain control, and in this case it would have been Black and Rollins and
yeah, I don't know. That
you
wasn't my experience in the House with him, but in the House he was a much more dominant figure. So I don't know. The thing I noticed about Jack, which affected him in 88 in the presidential race, 87, 88, and affected him again in 96, is that two things. One is, for example, he ends up in Iowa trying to explain the gold standard. It doesn't make any sense to people. There are limits to how far. If I couldn't sell a lunar colony, I guarantee he couldn't sell the gold standard. And he spent a lot more energy on it. I gave one speech. He gave, this was integral to what he was saying. And the other was, and this really affected him in 96, but I think it also affected him some in 88. To be effective at that level, unless you have an enormous amount of money, you have to have a message that is sufficiently clear and sufficiently disciplined that it becomes a unique selling proposition. And you have to operate within that message. Because every time you clutter it, you're going to dramatically weaken it. And it just struck me that watching him campaign and going out to help him, I also helped him in Michigan. In fact, I have friendships that go back to the Kemp campaign. Saul Anuzis was my driver going out there, for example, in Michigan. And I think Jack, I talked to his former head coach.
Which
Jack,
one? Saban or?
Yes, I think it's Saban, the relatively short ethnic background. During Jack's kickoff, because I was with him before the kickoff in Buffalo and then here and all that stuff. And I said to Saban, who I'd never really met before, I said, so how did you manage Kemp? And he said, I'll tell you. So we had a game that really mattered. I wanted him to run the ball. goes out, and he throws the ball. And it's not working. And I want him to run the ball. And he doesn't want to run the ball. We come in at halftime. I said, Jackie, come here. And he comes over. I push him into a locker, and I close the door. And he's yelling, Coach, Coach, let me out. And I said, Jackie, are you going to run the goddamn ball or not? He said, that is how you manage Jack Kemp. Well, I don't think he had it in him to go through a disciplined implementation. I think he got bored. And I think he was a natural rollout passer. And so he wanted to do something interesting. And I think that was a real challenge when he got to that level. It wasn't a challenge earlier, because earlier being interesting beat being boring. But when you're at the presidential level, a certain level of discipline, routine, repetition becomes really important.
Do you think he really wanted to be president?
I have no idea. I assume he did. I mean, he had an ego large enough to believe he could be president. He had seen presidents. You know, he knew Nixon. He knew Ford. He knew Carter. You know, and he knew Bush and Dole. So if you say, gee, Reagan was a different commodity. Eisenhower would have been a different commodity. If you knew those guys, you'd think, why not?
You were at the '88 convention?
Mm-hmm.
Were you there when the talk about his being Veep, as opposed to Quayle, was going on?
Yeah, but I don't remember any details.
Okay. You weren't in the suite or
No.
anything when he got the message. Okay. So he gets offered HUD.
By the way, it strikes me as wildly implausible that George H.W. Bush would ever have picked Kemp.
Because?
Kemp talked too much. Kemp represented the Reagan wing of the party. Kemp was, in fact, uncontrollable. You know, those are not the virtues of the Bushes.
Right, which is orderly. Yes.
Orderly, loyalty, boredom.
Okay.
Calm, methodical execution.
Right. So he gets offered HUD. Did you have any? Did he ask your advice about taking HUD?
No.
Okay.
And in some ways, it was a good gamble because, and I think even in George H.W. Bush's part, it was a good gamble. I mean, you're giving a guy a shot at an area Republicans normally don't do much in, to take a bunch of his own ideas and go out and see if he can get them to work. And I think Jack saw it that way. I think HUD was a much bigger management problem for him than he thought it would be, and tested things he didn't have strength at. And I think that was a huge part of the challenge he had at HUD, is that it's a nightmare if you're a good manager, and almost no one is. And so HUD's a very badly run agency as a general rule. And I think that mired Jack down a lot. But I think, on the other hand, he came closer to breakthrough on both including African Americans and developing interesting new policies to help the poor than anybody else has.
So what do you think his successes and failures were there?
I think they began implementing some programs that involved real experimentation and real empowerment. I think, on the other hand, there were some very significant, as I remember it, significant management breakdowns that were embarrassing and that didn't affect Jack directly, except that he was secretary, so he had to bear responsibility.
This is the period when the Amigos get going,
Yeah.
right? And which restaurant was it exactly that you?
There's a
called?
Mexican restaurant over on the Massachusetts side, which I don't think exists anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we
You
would
don't
meet-
remember the name of it?
No.
Because nobody seems to
No.
remember what the name of it was.
No, sorry.
Okay. So how often would you meet?
I would guess every 6 or 8 weeks. And you had Connie Mack, Kemp, Walker, Weber, and myself was sort of the core group.
And Vin Weber.
Vin Weber.
Yeah. So did you talk mainly about what his stuff was or your stuff was? Was it a?
I think it was a genuine mix, but again, you get sucked up into the larger political issues of where are we going, what are we doing, what's happening.
So did he talk about his frustrations with the Bush White House?
Not that I remember as being a major.
Darman, Baker, Sununu.
No,
No.
not that I remember being a major thing.
And so, what about your activities? I mean, this is the time when you're becoming whip and you're challenging Bob Michael and all of that. So, did he have advice for you on that?
No.
Because
I don't think Jack thought like a legislative politician. I don't think that was. Jack thought about big, expansive ideas and about constant innovation. And that's what attracted him, that's what got him excited, and that's what he was good at.
So when Bush broke his no new taxes pledge, there was some press speculation or talk that people were urging him to challenge Bush, which he probably was never going to do and didn't do. But did you know anything about that? Did you do it?
No.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
it might have been some columnists or something.
It would never have struck me that it was plausible. I mean, I'm of enough of an institutionalist that trying to take on an incumbent president, unless you have dramatically bigger problems, is just hopeless. It's one of those suicide missions.
So, did you ever have any fundamental disagreements with him?
I don't remember where Jack was on South Africa. And Walker and Weber and I played a key role in getting Ron Dellum's bill through and really unhinging the Reagan administration on South Africa. And that was part of a very conscious commitment to freedom across the whole planet. And I don't know where, so I just honestly don't remember. We concocted it and did it on our own, so I have no idea where Jack would have been on that, but my sense is he'd have been more of a Cold Warrior, be very cautious, you know.
He took no end of heat from Novak over wavering on the issue. He voted for the bill and then voted with Reagan on the override. And then I think it came up again and he voted with you all, if I remember correctly.
I mean, we represented his long-term natural biases, but he was a very strong Cold Warrior. And then there's a great meeting. I'd been very active in developing the Military Reform Caucus with Cheney and Nunn and Tribble and Gary Hart and Bill Whitehurst, and starting in '81, on the grounds we were all for the Reagan buildup, but by the way, if you're going to spend that much money, you ought to really overhaul the building. And the liberation of Grenada had been so incompetent that it really undermined the military's ability to defend, not reforming. And we had two very senior retired military, Davy Jones had been one of the Joint Chiefs, and Shai Meyer had been Chief of Staff of the Army, who were willing to actively testify that we needed jointness, which nowadays everybody takes for granted. So I was the third person to testify at the Goldwater-Nichols bill after Jones and Meyer. And we get down to a point where it gets through the House, gets through the Senate, comes out of conference. We're ready for the big vote. Reagan's opposed, Weinberger's opposed. Every current serving senior military is opposed. Kemp's opposed because he represents that wing. And we had a meeting in Lott's office.
What year?
This would have been '86. Lott was the whip. So we had a meeting in the Capitol in Lott's office. Goldwater comes over. He had a cane at that time. He was limping. And we're sitting there. And Jack is explaining, he's with Weinberger and not going to undermine the military. And finally, there's this great moment where Barry leans forward and he taps Kemp on the knee. He says, "Jack, the fucking system doesn't work." And Kemp just stares at him. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't have any answers. And votes with Weinberger in the minority. I mean, we ran over him by a huge margin. But it gave you a flavor of Jack, who had no idea how to do it with Goldwater when Goldwater was being earthy. And at the same time, Jack actually didn't know what he was talking about, but he knew what his biases were. And he knew who his allies were.
So in that sense, he was a traditionalist and not a reformer.
He was a traditionalist in defense, very much so.
He was a kind of a reformer as the ranking Republican on foreign ops.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was against World Bank appropriations and thought the World Bank was doing.
But that gets you back in economics.
Yeah.
where Jack had real knowledge and had a particular value system that made it pretty easy to critique the IMF and the World Bank. He didn't have the same level of information. In the Pentagon, I don't think he tried to form independent judgment. I think he tried to stick pretty close to the President and the Secretary of Defense.
So did you have any other disagreements with him that you can think of?
I don't remember offhand, but I'd have to think about it for a while. I mean, I'm sure there were occasions.
So, at when he was at Empower America, did he get involved in your activities in the House at all?
I don't know if he did personally. I know
like
Empower America did. So whether that was Jack or Gene or Bill, I don't remember.
And what about the '94 campaign?
I don't remember him playing a significant role in '94.
Contract with America?
Yeah, no.
So I read somewhere
at that point, I think Jack was making speeches and earning a living and having a pretty good time, and I think he was not directly engaged with us in trying to change the House.
I read somewhere that there were two items in the Contract of America that he was at odds with you about. One was the
balanced budget for sure.
Yeah. So what was his attitude toward balanced budgets?
Well, he didn't like them because he thought they led to tax increases. And they were violative of his idea that, in effect, you could cut taxes as a down payment on future growth.
And he was not one of the starve the beast tax cutters. In other
No.
words, that if you cut taxes enough, they won't have enough money to pay for
No,
things.
and it's just, to some extent, he was a forerunner of George W. Bush's big government conservatism. I mean,
Dick Darman does write in his book that the two conservatives in the cabinet, Bennett and Kemp, are the ones who are always asking for money.
yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. So
They're probably also the two most activist guys in the cabinet.
right. So do you remember any Empower America influence on policy during your time?
No, except to the degree that we would have shaped with them, for example, the capital gains tax cut. We would work with both them and with Heritage on that sort of thing.
Since the Amigos were meeting, and did he talk to you about how to deal with Clinton? Did he have any particular attitude toward Clinton? Okay. And the government shutdown and all of that stuff?
No, I don't remember him ever intervening.
Okay. So when the Monica Lewinsky thing happened, did he have any particular attitudes on that?
No.
So Bennett says that he and Kemp went to Joe Lieberman and tried to talk Joe Lieberman into going down to the White House and getting Clinton to resign. Do you have any recollection of that, or
No.
did he?
I wouldn't have been involved in that.
Yeah, or impeachment, or the '96 campaign, or '98 campaign. I mean,
Yeah.
when you sort of ran against Clinton on the Lewinsky
Yep.
issue. Nothing.
No.
He didn't do anything. Okay. So, in 1995, he decides he's not going to run for president. Did you encourage him to run for president? Did you hope he would run for president again in '96?
No. Actually, it was interesting. Jack, I think, ends up supporting Forbes.
Yes.
Um,
You thought you were flabbergasted. You said.
yeah, I mean, just didn't. It's a little bit like suggesting that he run against Bush in '92. I mean, Forbes did not strike me as a guy who had much of a chance of getting there. And in fact, I did have one conversation where I tried to get him to get Forbes out of the race, and he was not willing to do so. But we had probably in some ways changed roles a little bit in that by late '95, I'm an institutionalist. And I really think that our only two practical nominees are Lamar Alexander and Dole. And
Who were you for?
I was not for anybody, but functionally probably for Dole. But I've known Lamar for years and I like him a lot. So I wasn't endorsing anybody, but Dole had been very good to us as the Senate leader, and we had tried to be helpful to him in return.
Even though he was the tax collector of the welfare state.
Yeah, that was one of the funniest moments was when I did that, and then he promptly replaces Howard Baker, And I remember I was somewhere, and I get this phone call from some reporter who says, "So, how do you feel about the tax collector of the welfare state becoming the Senate leader?" And I thought, "Oh, this is just going to be a long day."
Well, what was Jack's attitude toward Dole? I mean, because they.
I think probably that he was the tax collector of the welfare state. I mean, I think Jack may have been as surprised as anybody when they approached him about being the vice presidential nominee.
Were you?
Yeah, I was happy because I like Kemp, and I thought he would bring energy and excitement to a ticket that needed energy and excitement. And I do think for a brief period he did. It was almost a little bit of the Sarah Palin effect. You have this initial burst of optimism and enthusiasm, and in that sense, it was a reasonable gamble.
And what memories do you have of the debate with Gore?
I was in New York doing something, and I saw the most painful debate I've ever watched. Because I love Jack, and he's a good friend, and I really thought he so totally underperformed that he did an enormous disservice to his own legacy. And
Why do you think he underperformed?
I suspect he didn't practice, he didn't pay attention, and he thought he could go out and wing it.
Is that in character?
Yeah, pretty much. And it works at a lot of levels. And Jack was dramatically better than most of the people he was measured against in the 70s. So it wasn't hard for him to learn that he was a better speaker, he was more dynamic, he was more interesting, he had more ideas, he knew more.
So I can handle this?
But going up against a sitting vice president who's a professional requires a different standard.
Right. Okay. So what after your speakership is over and you're doing your thing and he's doing his business kind of thing, what was your continuing relationship with him?
Oh, we'd see each other occasionally, particularly if I was in Colorado and he was out there. We'd have dinner and talk, and it was more general. I mean, he would opine on the planet and explain his views of things, and he seemed to be doing very well financially, and I think that was about all. But it was a much more, I think for both of us it was sort of like we were now in a different world.
So there were Reagan Republicans and Taft Republicans and Rockefeller Republicans, of which you were once one. Are there Kemp Republicans? Should there be Kemp Republicans?
Well, I think Kemp was enormously important in both developing the idea of economic opportunity and lower rates and more growth-oriented dynamism, and in developing ideas about genuinely rethinking how we try to help the poor and how we try to help neighborhoods and areas that are poor. So in that sense, I think he's extraordinarily important, and I think it's unfortunate, I think, that had the influence of Kemp been decisive, we would probably today be an overwhelmingly dominant governing party, because I think he brought the pieces the party doesn't have. But I also think it's fair to say that waned, and which is unfortunate.
So the moment that he might have made that kind of difference was 80 as Veep or 88 as Veep, or how could it have happened, or if he won the nomination?
Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, if, short of winning the nomination, I don't know how you do it. I mean, maybe Veep in 88. I mean, I think whether a Reagan-Kemp ticket could have won in 80 is an interesting question, because it would have given the moderates no reason to support the ticket. And I think Reagan was very vividly aware of what happened to Goldwater, and of the danger that if you don't find some reason for moderates to buy in, that you could lose. So it's easy to go back, But I think that a Kemp influence on the party would have been vastly healthier than a Bush influence on the party, because Bush really is a regular, and all the things that implies. The other challenge, I spent a lot of time on this after I stepped down in '99. If you think of Kemp and I as sort of generally in the same direction, and Reagan, it's interesting that Thatcher and Reagan changed the world. but neither of them changes the culture of their party. And I changed the entire trajectory of the House Republican Party, and I couldn't change the culture. The very people we elevated as chairman were the people who didn't have a clue why they became chairman. And so Kemp is part of that same picture. That we had Weber says at one point that the bureaucratic politician will always beat the charismatic politician. I think there's a fair amount to that, because the bureaucratic politician accumulates the instruments of power, and they're there institutionally after the charisma.
So is there, I mean, it almost seems romantic, his attitude that the party of Lincoln can come back, that minorities can be find their natural home in the Republican Party. I mean, but it's so is it realistic that it could ever happen?
Oh, sure. I mean, Kemp was dealing with the great challenge of the last 40 years, which is that liberalism has failed the poor at levels that are unimaginable, and that nobody has been able to articulate because it is such heresy. And so, I mean, Jack was on the edge of something enormous. I mean, my prediction is it'll sink in the next 4 years that this has been the most destructive president for African American poor people, probably since the Great Depression. And when we look at the real costs, they're going to be horrendous. It's a little bit like Detroit. I mean, Detroit's survival is going to be by cutting itself in half. That's an astonishing failure. But Kemp, I'm going to go back to the charismatic bureaucratic model. Kemp never figured out how to have 2 or 3 good bureaucrats around him who could build mechanisms. And in the absence of mechanisms, you don't get the scale of change you need. And, we'll see. I mean, I am very deeply shaped by Kemp. I mean, he was, if you would ask the people I've known personally who've really affected me, he would be right after Reagan in terms of genuinely getting me to think differently and to approach things differently.
Sum up how?
Oh, I'm much more passionate about a solution-oriented, opportunity-oriented, empowerment-oriented, inclusive party that aggressively takes responsibility for helping people solve their problems than I think I would have been had I entered. If you imagine the House Republican Party after Watergate without Kemp, it is a desert. I mean, that Kemp was literally the one-eyed man in the land of the blind. He was the only symbol of energy, enthusiasm, optimism. I mean, Stockman wasn't. Stockman was just a smart guy. He was a clever manipulator. But he wasn't charismatic. And Jack is a genuinely charismatic leader. He spoke from the heart. He spoke from within. He marched to his own drummer. And as a result, the vibrancy he gave, I'm sure that Vin had a similar sense, that here was a guy who created a zone within which you could flourish, and there wasn't anybody else in the House Republican Party.
So, final question, unless you have something to add. So what does Kemp have to teach the contemporary political environment, and specifically Republicans?
Ideas matter. Courage matters. Persistence matters. Energy matters. I think the phrase cheerful persistence, which we developed at COS, in many ways comes from Kemp. That's why he's the closest thing to Theodore Roosevelt. The ebullient, constant, somebody once said of Teddy Roosevelt that every stone he found on the beach was new. Jack had that ability. I mean, the sun rose this morning. It was an extraordinary moment. And you had that sense of engagement. Jack brought, and this will sound goofy, in a very real sense, Jack brought love into the party. He loved people. He loved life. He made you, I'm going to get teary-eyed. Maybe you just had this sense of he was a genuine comrade. You were companions on a quest. It's a rare talent.
Thanks.
Okay.